The rope cut into Nora's wrists before she even understood what was happening. One moment she was standing in the kitchen of the only home she had ever known, and the next, two men she did not recognize were pulling her out the door, while her uncle watched from the porch with his arms crossed and his face turned away. "Uncle Peter," she said, her voice cracking, "please, tell them there is a mistake." He did not look at her. He said nothing at all. That silence told her everything words could not. The men dragged her across the frozen yard, past the barn where she used to feed the goats every morning, past the fence she had painted white just that spring, and threw her into the back of a covered wagon that smelled of hay and something sour she could not name. The wagon door slammed shut, and darkness swallowed her whole. Nora pressed her back against the wooden slats and pulled her knees to her chest. Her wrists throbbed where the rope had rubbed the skin raw. Outside, she heard her uncle's voice, low and businesslike, speaking with the man who had led the operation. Money changed hands. She heard the clink of coins, the rustle of a folded paper, and then footsteps walking away without hesitation, without looking back. She was 17 years old, and she had just been sold like a sack of grain. The wagon lurched forward, and Nora's whole body swayed with the movement. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to think of anything other than the cold reality pressing down on her chest. Just that morning, she had been peeling potatoes for breakfast, humming a song her mother used to sing before she passed away 3 years ago. She had believed, foolishly, that her uncle cared for her, that taking her in after her parents died was an act of love, and not an investment waiting to mature. She understood now. She had been raised like livestock, fed and sheltered only so she could be sold for a better price once she came of age. The wagon rattled over uneven roads for what felt like hours. Nora lost track of time in the darkness. She could hear other sounds now, muffled voices from outside, the occasional bark of a dog, and once, unmistakably, a low growl that did not belong to any dog she had ever heard. It rumbled through the wooden walls of the wagon and settled somewhere deep in her stomach, a warning she did not yet understand. She had heard stories about the packs. Everyone had. Stories about men and women who were not entirely men and women, who could shift into something powerful and dangerous under the right circumstances. Her uncle used to tell her those stories were nothing but folk tales meant to frighten children into staying close to home after dark. But the growl she had just heard did not sound like folklore. It sounded real, and it sounded close. The wagon finally stopped. Nora heard footsteps circle around to the back, and then the door swung open, letting in a flood of harsh light that made her wince. A man with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw looked in at her, unsmiling. "Out," he said, his voice flat, as though he had said the word 100 times before, to 100 different people. Nora did not move fast enough for his liking. He reached in, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her out with a force that made her stumble onto the muddy ground. She caught herself before she fell completely, her palms scraping against small stones scattered across the path. She looked up and saw where she had been brought. It was a large building, more like a warehouse than anything else, tucked away at the edge of a town she did not recognize. The windows were boarded, and torches burned along the outer walls despite it being daytime, as though the people inside preferred to keep the world from seeing what happened within. "Move," the scarred man said, pulling her forward by the rope still binding her wrists. Nora's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk. She would not let them see her collapse. She would not give them that satisfaction. Whatever happened next, she promised herself she would face it standing. They led her through a side entrance and down a narrow hallway lit by flickering lanterns. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and something metallic she tried not to think about. As they walked, she passed by other doors, some open, some closed. Through one open door, she glimpsed a room full of people sitting on the floor, chained together in 2s and 3s, their eyes hollow and their expressions empty, as though they had already given up on the idea of a future. Her stomach turned. Was this what waited for her too? A life reduced to waiting, to being looked over and priced and sold to whoever offered the most? The scarred man stopped in front of a small room at the end of the hallway and shoved her inside. "Someone will come for you when it's time," he said, and then he shut the door, leaving her alone, in near total darkness, except for a sliver of light coming through a crack near the ceiling. Nora sank to the floor, her back against the cold stone wall. She tried to keep her breathing steady, tried to think of a plan, any plan, that could get her out of this place. But every idea that came to mind dissolved the moment she considered the reality of her situation. She was alone, in an unfamiliar town, with no money, no allies, and her wrists still bound. She thought of her mother, of the warmth in her voice whenever she used to tell Nora that she was stronger than she believed herself to be. She thought of her father, who had taught her how to stand tall even when her knees wanted to buckle. She held on to those memories now like a lifeline, letting them steady the storm building inside her chest. Time passed slowly in that small room. Nora could not tell if it had been minutes or hours when the door finally opened again. This time, it was not the scarred man. It was a woman, older, with tired eyes and a kindness in her expression that seemed out of place in a building like this. "Come with me," the woman said gently. "It's time." "Time for what?" Nora asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. The woman did not answer directly. Instead, she reached out and, to Nora's surprise, loosened the rope around her wrists, just slightly, enough to ease the pressure without fully freeing her. "Stand up straight when they look at you," she whispered. "The ones who slouch and cry, they get treated worse. Trust me." Nora swallowed hard and nodded. She did not know this woman, did not know if she could trust her, but there was something in her voice, something that sounded like she had lived through this exact fear before, and wanted to spare Nora even a small piece of the pain. They walked together down another hallway, this one wider, leading toward a large open space filled with the low murmur of a crowd. Nora's heart began to pound. Through a gap in the curtain ahead, she could see rows of people seated on benches, their faces hidden partly in shadow, watching a raised wooden platform at the front of the room. An auction. It was exactly what she feared. "What is this place?" Nora whispered, though she already understood far too well. "A market," the woman said quietly, "for people the world has decided don't matter." "I'm sorry, child. I truly am." Nora's chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. She watched as a young man was led out onto the platform ahead of her, his hands bound just as hers were, his eyes darting nervously across the crowd. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a booming voice, began calling out numbers, and the crowd responded with raised hands and shouted figures, as though they were bidding on furniture rather than a human life. The young man was sold within minutes to a group of rough-looking men who dragged him away without a single word of comfort. Nora watched him disappear through a side door and wondered if she would ever know what happened to him after that. "You're next after two more," the woman told her, checking a small piece of paper in her hand. "Stay strong. Whatever happens up there, don't let them see you break." Nora nodded, though her whole body trembled with fear. She watched as another person was led onto the platform, an older woman who barely raised her eyes from the floor the entire time she stood there. The bidding was quick and cold, numbers thrown back and forth like it was nothing at all, and then she too was gone. Then it was Nora's turn. The woman who had walked her here gave her hand one final gentle squeeze before letting go. "Chin up," she whispered. Nora stepped forward into the light. The platform beneath her feet felt unsteady, though she knew it was solid wood. The crowd's eyes turned toward her all at once, a wave of attention that made her skin crawl. She forced herself to stand as straight as she could manage, remembering the woman's advice, remembering her father's voice telling her that fear was only powerful if she let it control her. The auctioneer walked around her slowly, sizing her up the way someone might examine a horse before a race. "A fine young woman," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying easily through the open room. "Healthy. Obedient, I'm told. Let's start the bidding at a fair price." Numbers began to fly. Nora tried not to look at the faces calling them out, tried to keep her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall so she would not have to see the greed and calculation in the eyes of the people deciding her fate. But she could not block out their voices entirely, and each new number felt like another nail driven into the coffin of the life she used to imagine for herself. A tall man near the front raised his hand, and his bid silenced several others immediately. There was something about him that made the crowd shrink back slightly, a tension that rippled outward from where he stood. Nora could not see his face clearly from the platform, only the outline of broad shoulders and a stillness in his posture that felt different from everyone else in the room, more controlled, more deliberate. "A generous offer," the auctioneer said, though his voice had taken on a slightly nervous edge. "Do I hear higher?" Silence answered him. No one dared to challenge the bid. The auctioneer cleared his throat and turned to Nora as if to close the sale. But before he could speak another word, a voice rang out from the back of the room, low and steady, carrying an authority that made every single person in the crowd turn their heads at once. "I shall take her." The room fell utterly silent. Even the auctioneer seemed to freeze in place. Nora's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that for a moment she thought she might have misheard. She turned her eyes toward the source of the voice and saw a man rising from the shadows at the very back of the room, tall and broad, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, though none of them dared speak loud enough for him to hear. Nora did not know who he was, but she understood, without needing to be told, that everyone else in that room feared him more than they feared anything else in their lives. He walked toward the platform, and the crowd parted before him without a single word being exchanged. Nora stood frozen, her bound hands trembling at her sides, watching him approach with a strange mixture of terror and something else she could not quite name. Whatever happened next, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Her life had just changed forever. The auctioneer's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "Sir, we already have a leading bid from the gentleman at the front. The rules of the house require—" "I am aware of the rules of this house," the tall man said, cutting him off without raising his voice at all. The calm in his tone was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "And I am aware that you built this place on the backs of people who never agreed to be here. I did not come to argue about rules. I came to end this particular sale. Name your price, and let us be done with it." The man who had placed the earlier bid, the one near the front of the room, slowly lowered his hand and sank back into his seat without a word of protest. Nora watched the color drain from his face as he refused to meet the newcomer's eyes. The auctioneer swallowed hard and named a price, one considerably higher than the previous bid had been. Nora expected some kind of negotiation, some back and forth, but the tall man simply nodded once and reached into his coat, producing a leather pouch that he tossed onto the platform without ceremony. The sound of coins hitting wood echoed through the silent room. "Release her," he said. Two men Nora had not noticed before stepped forward from the shadows near the platform and began undoing the ropes around her wrists. She flexed her fingers as the circulation returned, wincing at the raw skin beneath, but she barely registered the pain. Her attention was fixed entirely on the man now standing at the base of the platform, watching her with an expression she could not read. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had seemed from a distance. He had dark hair, cut short and neat, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray with a hint of something sharper hidden beneath. A scar ran along his jaw, thin and old, the kind of mark that came from a fight survived rather than a fight lost. He wore no fine clothes, nothing to announce wealth or status, and yet everyone in that room had gone quiet the moment he spoke, as though his very presence commanded a respect that money could never buy. "Come down from there," he said to her, his voice softer now, though still firm. Nora hesitated only a moment before descending the short steps at the edge of the platform. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, partly from the ordeal of the day, and partly from an emotion she could not quite place, somewhere between relief and a fresh kind of fear. She had been sold, yes, but to whom, and for what purpose, she still did not know. "My name is Damon," he said once she stood before him. "You have nothing more to fear in this building. We are leaving." "Where are you taking me?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safer than here," he said simply. "That is all you need to know for now." He turned and began walking toward the exit, without waiting to see if she would follow. Nora glanced around the room one last time, at the auctioneer counting his coins with shaking hands, at the crowd still whispering among themselves, none of them quite meeting her eyes. She thought of the young man who had been sold before her, of the older woman who never lifted her gaze from the floor, and she wondered what would become of them now that this man named Damon had walked into their world and disrupted its cruel order, even if only for her. She followed him out. Outside, the afternoon air felt shockingly fresh after the stale, smoky atmosphere of the auction house. Nora took a deep breath, filling her lungs as though she had been holding them the entire time she was inside. A group of people waited near a set of horses at the edge of the road, all of them turning to look as Damon approached with Nora a few steps behind him. "This is her?" one of them asked. A woman with sharp eyes and dark hair pulled back into a tight braid. "Yes," Damon said simply, offering no further explanation. The woman studied Nora for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before nodding once and stepping aside. "The horses are ready." Nora stared at the animals, then at the small group of strangers watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and caution, then finally back at Damon. "I don't understand," she said. "Why did you do that? Why buy me at all?" Damon turned to face her fully for the first time since they had left the building. For a moment, something flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like discomfort, as though the question had caught him off guard, despite his composed exterior. "Because no one else in that room would have," he said finally, "and because leaving you there was not something I was willing to do." It was not a complete answer, and Nora sensed there was more beneath the surface of his words that he was choosing not to share. But something in his tone told her that pressing further would not get her anywhere, not yet. "You still haven't told me where we're going," she said instead. "North," he said, "to my territory. It will take the better part of 2 days to reach it." Nora's stomach tightened at the word territory. She thought again of the growl she had heard from inside the wagon earlier that day, of the old stories her uncle used to dismiss as nothing more than folklore. She studied Damon more closely now, searching for some sign that would confirm or deny her growing suspicion, but he gave nothing away. "Are you one of them?" she asked quietly. "One of the pack leaders?" Something like the ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "You could say that," he said. "I am the alpha of my pack. Does that frighten you?" Nora thought about the question honestly before answering. Everything about this day had frightened her, from the moment her uncle turned his back on her, to the moment she stood on that platform waiting to hear how much she was worth to a room full of strangers. And yet, standing here now, in the presence of a man who had just paid an enormous sum of money to free her from that fate, without asking for anything in return, she found that her fear had shifted into something more complicated. "I don't know yet," she admitted honestly. Damon studied her for a long moment, as though her honesty surprised him. "A fair answer," he said finally. He gestured toward one of the horses. "Can you ride?" "A little," Nora said. "My father taught me when I was young." "Good enough." He helped her onto the horse with more gentleness than she expected from someone who had spoken so coldly to the auctioneer only minutes before. His hands were steady, careful not to grip too tightly, and once she was settled, he stepped back and mounted his own horse in a single fluid motion. The small group set off down the road, leaving the auction house and its cruel silence behind them. Nora looked back once, watching the boarded windows and flickering torches grow smaller in the distance, and felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that she had escaped whatever fate awaited her inside those walls. Grief for the people still trapped there, for the young man and the older woman and countless others she would never know the names of. She turned her attention forward again, toward the unknown road ahead, and the unfamiliar man leading the way. Whatever waited for her at the end of this journey, she understood that her old life was gone completely, sold away, along with everything she used to know. All that remained now was whatever came next. The woman with the dark braid rode up beside her after a while, studying her with the same careful curiosity as before.
"I'm Grace,"
she said.
"I ride with Damon's pack. You'll be safe with us, whatever you've heard about our kind."
"Thank you," Nora said, though the words felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar, after a day spent surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than an object to be priced and sold. "Don't thank me yet," Grace said, not unkindly. "You've got a lot to learn about where you're headed. It isn't like anything you've known before." Nora looked ahead at Damon's straight back, at the easy confidence with which he led their small group through the fading afternoon light, and wondered exactly what kind of world she was riding into. Night fell before the group stopped to make camp. Nora's legs ached from hours in the saddle, and her wrists still throbbed where the rope had rubbed them raw, but she said nothing about her discomfort. She had learned early that day that showing weakness in front of strangers rarely worked in her favor, and though something about Damon's group felt different from the auction house, old habits of caution did not disappear so easily. They stopped in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines, the kind of place that seemed carved out of the wilderness, specifically for travelers passing through. Grace dismounted first, and began giving quiet instructions to the others, a young man named Ethan, and an older man named Victor who Nora had not spoken with yet. Damon helped Nora down from her horse, his hand steady beneath her elbow as her stiff legs threatened to buckle beneath her. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a large flat rock near the center of the clearing. "Rest. You've had a difficult day." Nora sank onto the rock gratefully, watching as the others moved around the campsite with practiced efficiency, gathering firewood and setting up small tents. No one ordered her to help. No one treated her like the property she had been only hours earlier. It felt strange, almost disorienting, after the treatment she had endured throughout the day. Ethan built a fire quickly, and soon warm light flickered across the clearing, pushing back the deepening darkness of the forest around them. Nora watched the flames dance, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over, unable to fully process how drastically her circumstances had shifted between morning and night. "You should eat something," Grace said, appearing beside her with a small bundle of bread and dried meat. "It isn't much, but it will hold you until we reach proper food tomorrow." "Thank you," Nora said again, taking the offered food. Her stomach growled the moment the smell reached her, reminding her that she had not eaten anything since the previous evening, before her entire world had been upended. She ate in silence, watching the group around her with careful attention. Victor sat near the fire, sharpening a knife, with slow, methodical strokes, occasionally glancing up to survey the surrounding trees, as though standing guard even while seated. Ethan moved between tasks with restless energy, checking on the horses, adjusting the fire, never quite settling in one place for long. And Damon sat slightly apart from the others, close enough to be part of the group, but distant enough that Nora sensed he preferred it that way. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said finally, directing her question toward Grace, who sat nearby, mending a small tear in her jacket. "Of course." "Why did he do it? Damon, I mean. Buying me like that?" Nora glanced toward the Alpha, who appeared not to be listening, though something in the set of his shoulders told her he was aware of every word being spoken. Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Damon doesn't do things without reason, even when his reasons aren't obvious to everyone else," she said, carefully. "He's not a man who explains himself easily, but I can tell you this much. He's walked past plenty of auctions before without stepping in. Something about today was different." "What do you mean?" Grace shrugged, though her expression suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. "That's a question for him, not me. All I can tell you is that whatever brought him to that platform today, it wasn't something small." Nora turned this information over in her mind, studying Damon from across the fire. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees, staring into the flames with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were far away from the campsite. There was a heaviness to him, she realized, something beneath the composed exterior that hinted at old pain, carried quietly for a very long time. As if sensing her gaze, Damon looked up and met her eyes directly. Nora felt a jolt of something unexpected pass between them. Not quite fear, not quite comfort, but something new she did not have a name for yet. She looked away first, feeling her cheeks warm despite the cool night air. "Get some rest," Damon said, his voice carrying easily across the small clearing. "We have a long ride tomorrow, and you'll need your strength." Nora nodded and allowed Grace to show her to a small tent set up at the edge of the camp. Inside, a thin bedroll waited, along with a folded blanket that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. She lay down carefully, her body exhausted despite the whirlwind of thoughts still spinning through her mind. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by images of the auction platform, of her uncle's turned back, of the woman who had helped loosen her ropes before sending her out to be sold. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with storm-gray eyes, watching her from across a fire that never seemed to burn out. She woke before dawn to the sound of quiet movement outside her tent. Peering out, she saw Damon standing at the edge of the clearing, alone, looking out into the darkness of the forest beyond. There was something vulnerable about him in that unguarded moment, something she suspected he rarely allowed anyone to witness. Nora crawled out of her tent quietly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders against the early morning chill. She approached slowly, unsure if she was welcome, but Damon glanced back at the sound of her footsteps and did not tell her to leave. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Too much to think about," she admitted, coming to stand a respectful distance away from him. "You too, it seems." "I don't sleep much," he said simply. "Habit, mostly." When you lead a pack, there's always something that needs watching. Nora studied his profile in the dim pre-dawn light, the sharp line of his jaw, the tension held in his shoulders even now, alone in a quiet forest, with no immediate threat in sight. Grace said you don't usually stop at auctions like that one, she said carefully. That something about yesterday was different. Damon's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment Nora thought he might refuse to answer. But then he let out a slow breath, his shoulders loosening just slightly. I lost someone once, he said finally, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. A long time ago. She was taken, sold, much the way you were yesterday. I was too young then, too powerless to stop it. By the time I had the strength and the position to do anything about it, it was too late for her. Nora's chest tightened at the raw honesty in his words. I'm sorry, she said softly. It was a long time ago, Damon said, though the pain in his voice suggested the wound had never fully healed. But I made a promise to myself after that I would never again stand by and watch someone sold like property without doing something about it, if it was within my power to stop it. Yesterday, it was within my power. So this wasn't just about me, Nora said quietly, understanding dawning slowly. It could have been anyone on that platform. Something complicated passed across Damon's expression, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding. It could have been, he admitted, but it wasn't. It was you. The way he said it, low and certain, sent a strange warmth spreading through Nora's chest, one she did not fully understand, and was not entirely ready to examine too closely. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how close they stood together in the quiet forest, the first hints of dawn beginning to color the sky above the treetops. Thank you, she said finally, for stepping in. Whatever your reasons, I would have faced a much darker fate without you. Damon nodded once, accepting her gratitude without further comment. We should wake the others, he said, the moment of vulnerability closing as quickly as it had opened. We have ground to cover today. Nora watched him walk back toward the camp, already returning to the composed, commanding presence she had witnessed at the auction house. But she carried the memory of those few quiet minutes with her as she followed, tucking away the glimpse of the man beneath the alpha, the wound that still ached beneath his controlled exterior, the promise that had brought him to her rescue. Whatever waited for her at the end of this journey, she understood now that Damon was not simply a feared leader acting on a whim. He was a man shaped by loss, driven by a vow he had carried for years, and somehow, she had become the latest chapter in that long, quiet story. The camp stirred to life around them as the others woke and began preparing for the day ahead. Grace handed out simple provisions for breakfast, while Ethan and Victor broke down the tents and readied the horses. Nora ate quickly, her mind still turning over everything Damon had shared with her in those private pre-dawn minutes. As they mounted their horses and set off once more toward the north, Nora found herself watching Damon's back with new eyes, seeing not just the feared alpha who had silenced an entire room with 3 simple words, but the boy who had once lost someone he could not save, carrying that grief into every decision he made since. The road ahead still stretched long and uncertain, but for the first time since her uncle's silence had broken her heart the previous morning, Nora felt something other than fear stirring inside her chest. It felt, cautiously, like the smallest thread of hope. By midday, the landscape had begun to change. The flat farmland Nora had grown up around gave way to rolling hills covered in dense forest, and the road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for 2 horses to travel side by side. Nora noticed the shift in the group's demeanor as they rode, a subtle sharpening of attention, as though they were drawing closer to something that demanded caution. We're nearing the border, Grace explained when Nora asked about the change. This is where Damon's territory begins. Other packs know better than to cross it without permission, but that doesn't mean trouble never finds its way in. Nora glanced around at the surrounding trees with fresh unease. What kind of trouble? The kind you don't need to worry about with Damon riding beside you, Ethan said cheerfully, from a few paces ahead, flashing her a grin over his shoulder. He seemed to carry a lighter energy than the rest of the group, and Nora found herself grateful for it after the tension of the previous day. They rode in relative quiet for another hour, before Victor, who had ridden ahead to scout the path, came galloping back with an urgency that immediately put the entire group on alert. Riders, he said, pulling his horse to a stop beside Damon. 6 of them, maybe 7, coming from the East Ridge. Damon's expression shifted instantly, the relaxed set of his shoulders replaced by a coiled readiness that reminded Nora sharply of the man who had silenced an entire auction house with a single sentence. "Whose colors?" he asked. "None that I recognized," Victor said. "But they're armed, and they're moving with purpose." Damon turned to Nora, his gray eyes sharp with focus. "Stay close to Grace. Whatever happens, do not wander from her side." Before Nora could respond, the sound of approaching hooves reached them, and moments later, a group of riders emerged from the tree line ahead, blocking the narrow path forward. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cold, calculating expression, brought his horse to a stop several paces away, studying Damon's group with open hostility. "Well," the man said, his voice carrying an oily confidence that immediately set Nora on edge, "if it isn't the great Alpha Damon, wandering so far from his precious territory. And what's this you've brought with you?" His eyes shifted to Nora, and something predatory flickered across his expression that made her stomach twist with dread. She fought the urge to shrink back, remembering the woman's advice from the auction house about standing tall, though every instinct screamed at her to disappear behind Grace entirely. "This doesn't concern you, Victor," Damon said, and Nora realized with a start that he was addressing the leader of the opposing riders, a coincidence of names that briefly confused her, before she pushed the thought aside to focus on the danger at hand. "Doesn't concern me?" The rival Victor said, a cold smile spreading across his face. "I heard an interesting rumor from the auction house yesterday. Heard the great Alpha spent a small fortune on a girl who didn't even fetch half that price from anyone else in the room. Seems like poor judgment for a man known for his careful decisions." "My decisions are my own to make," Damon said, his voice remaining level despite the clear provocation. "I suggest you and your men move along. This road belongs to my territory, and you know the terms under which you're permitted to cross it." The rival's smile widened, though it never reached his eyes. "Terms can change, can't they? Especially when there's something valuable enough on the table to make it worth the risk." Nora's heart pounded as she realized the man was talking about her, discussing her as though she were nothing more than a prize to be won or stolen away, exactly as she had been treated on that auction platform. The old fear rose up inside her, but beneath it, something new stirred as well, a flicker of anger at being spoken about so casually, as though her own thoughts and feelings held no weight in the conversation at all. "I am not for sale," Nora said, surprising herself as much as everyone else with the steadiness in her voice. "Not to him, not to anyone." The rival Victor's eyes flicked toward her, amusement flashing across his face at her interruption. "Feisty," he said, addressing Damon rather than her directly, as though her words meant nothing, simply because she had spoken them. "I can see why you paid so much." Damon's expression darkened, a low warning rumbling in his chest that Nora felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to pass through the very air around them. "You will address her with respect, or you will not address her at all," he said, his voice dropping into something far more dangerous than before. "This is your final warning. Move along, or face the consequences of trespassing on my territory, with clear hostile intent." For a tense moment, no one moved. Nora held her breath, watching the rival Victor's expression as he weighed his options, his gaze flicking between Damon and the small group behind him, calculating whether the confrontation was worth pursuing further. Finally, the rival's smile faded into something colder, more calculating. "Another time then," he said, pulling his horse back and gesturing for his men to do the same. "This isn't finished, Damon. You've made yourself a target, taking her the way you did. Word travels fast, and not everyone will be as willing to simply let this go as I am today." "I welcome the challenge," Damon said flatly. "Now leave my territory before I change my mind about letting you walk away from this at all." The rival group retreated slowly, disappearing back into the tree line the way they had come, though the tension in the air remained long after they had vanished from sight. Nora let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly on the reins. "Are you all right?" Grace asked, riding closer and studying Nora with concern. "I think so," Nora said, though her voice shook slightly. "Who was that man?" "A rival pack leader," Grace explained, her expression grim. "There's bad blood between him and Damon that goes back years. Long before you came into the picture. He's been looking for an excuse to cause trouble, and I'm afraid you might have just given him one." Nora looked toward Damon, who sat rigid in his saddle, staring in the direction the rival group had disappeared, with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were still very much focused on the confrontation. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, though she was not entirely sure what she was apologizing for. "If this causes trouble for you and your pack because of me—" "Don't," Damon said, cutting her off firmly. "You have nothing to apologize for. None of this is your doing. It's mine, for taking a stand yesterday when others would have simply looked away." He paused, his gray eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "And I would do it again, without hesitation, regardless of the consequences." Nora held his gaze, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest at his words. Whatever complications lay ahead, because of the choice he had made at that auction house, he showed no sign of regret, no hint that he wished he had simply walked past her, as easily as everyone else in that room had been willing to do. "We should keep moving," Victor said, breaking the moment. "The border crossing isn't far now. Better to reach it before nightfall." The group set off again, though the atmosphere had shifted noticeably since the confrontation. Nora noticed the others riding closer together now, more alert, more watchful of the surrounding forest. She found herself instinctively drawing closer to Damon as well, some part of her recognizing, despite everything she still did not understand about him and his world, that she felt safest near him. They crossed into Damon's official territory, just as the sun began to dip low on the horizon, marked by nothing more than a simple wooden post, carved with symbols Nora did not recognize. But the moment they passed it, she felt a subtle shift in the air itself, as though the very land recognized its alpha's return, and settled into a quieter kind of peace around them. "Welcome home," Damon said quietly, glancing back at her as they rode deeper into the territory that would now, for reasons she was still coming to understand, become her home as well. Nora looked around at the thick forest surrounding them, at the distant glow of what appeared to be a settlement nestled among the hills ahead, and felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of standing at the very beginning of a new chapter she had never imagined for herself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever danger the rival Victor's threats might bring in the days to come, she found herself, for the first time since her uncle's betrayal, looking forward, rather than only fearing what came next. The settlement Nora had glimpsed from a distance revealed itself to be far larger than she had expected once they rode into it fully. Wooden buildings lined a wide central road, smoke curling from chimneys into the evening sky, and people moved about their business with an ease and orderliness that felt worlds apart from the desperate, watchful atmosphere she had grown used to over the past 2 days. Heads turned as their small group rode through the settlement, curious eyes following their progress toward a large hall situated at the center of the community. Nora felt the weight of those stares acutely, aware that she was an obvious stranger among people who clearly all knew each other, and knew their alpha's habits well enough to be surprised by the sight of him returning with someone new. "Word will spread quickly that you're here," Grace murmured to her, as they dismounted in front of the hall. "Try not to let it unsettle you. Curiosity isn't the same as hostility." Nora nodded, though her nerves remained on edge as she followed Damon toward the entrance of the hall. Inside, the space opened into a large gathering room with a fire burning in a hearth at the far end, tables and chairs arranged throughout, and a handful of people already present who looked up sharply at their arrival. An older woman rose from one of the tables immediately, her expression shifting from mild surprise to open astonishment as her gaze landed on Nora. "Damon," she said, crossing the room quickly, "what is the meaning of this?" "Not now, Mara," Damon said, though his tone carried no real sharpness, more weariness than anything else. "She's had a long 2 days. Explanations can wait until morning." The woman named Mara studied Nora with an intensity that made her want to shrink back, though she forced herself to hold her ground, remembering once again the advice that had carried her through the auction. "You brought an Omega into this pack without a word of warning to any of us," Mara said, her voice lower now but no less intense. "Do you understand what kind of questions this will raise? What kind of position this puts you in?" "I understand perfectly well," Damon said, his voice hardening slightly, "and I will address every question in due time. Tonight, she needs rest and a proper meal, not an interrogation in the middle of the hall." Mara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further. though her eyes lingered on Nora with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between suspicion and something that almost looked like concern. Finally she turned and walked away, disappearing through a side door without another word. "Don't mind her," Grace said quietly, noticing Nora's uneasy expression. "Mara has been with this pack a long time. She worries about Damon more than anyone else here, even if she has an odd way of showing it. She'll come around." Nora nodded, though she could not shake the feeling that her arrival had disrupted something larger than she understood, some careful balance within the pack that her presence now threatened to unsettle. She thought of the rival Victor's words from earlier that day, about the position Damon had put himself in by claiming her, and wondered exactly how much trouble her rescue was going to cause for the man who had shown her nothing but consideration since the moment he stepped forward at the auction. Damon led her to a smaller room off the main hall, simply furnished, but clean and warm, a stark contrast to the cell she had spent hours in before the auction. "This will be your room," he said. "No one will disturb you here without your permission. I'll have food brought to you shortly." "Thank you," Nora said, glancing around the space before turning back to him. "Damon, that woman, Mara, what did she mean about the position this puts you in?" Damon was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh how much to share with her. "There are traditions within pack society," he said finally. "When an alpha claims an omega, even simply by purchasing her freedom the way I did, it carries certain expectations. Some will assume there is more to my intentions than a desire to see you safe." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. "And is there?" she asked before she could stop herself, immediately wishing she could take the question back. Something flickered across Damon's expression, gone before she could fully read it. "I brought you here to protect you," he said carefully. "Nothing more is expected of you in return. Whatever assumptions others might make, you are free to build whatever life you choose here, on your own terms." It was not quite an answer to her question, but Nora sensed that pressing further would only make the moment more uncomfortable than it already was. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time, "for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I don't know how else to express how much it means, everything you've done." Damon nodded once, his expression softening slightly. "Rest well, Nora. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight, you are safe." He left her alone in the room, and Nora sank onto the small bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger of the day had passed. A young girl arrived shortly after with a tray of food, warm stew and fresh bread that tasted better than anything Nora could remember eating in longer than she cared to think about. As she ate, her mind wandered back over everything that had happened since Damon had stepped out of the shadows at the auction house. The rival Victor's threats, Mara's obvious disapproval, the strange warmth that had bloomed in her chest each time Damon looked at her with that quiet intensity in his gray eyes. She did not fully understand her own feelings yet, tangled as they were with fear and gratitude, and something else she was not ready to name. Sleep came easier that night than it had the previous evening, though her dreams remained restless, filled with fragmented images of auction platforms and rival riders, and storm-gray eyes watching over her from across flickering firelight. She woke the next morning, to sunlight streaming through a small window, and for a moment, disoriented, she forgot entirely where she was. Then the memories of the past 2 days rushed back, and she sat up slowly, taking in the unfamiliar room around her, with fresh eyes, now that daylight illuminated every detail. A soft knock came at the door, and Grace poked her head in, offering a warm smile. "Good, you're awake. I thought you might like to see more of the settlement today, if you're feeling up to it." Nora nodded gratefully, glad for the company, and the distraction from her own tangled thoughts. She dressed quickly in simple clothes that had been left for her, plain but comfortable, a far cry from the fine dresses she imagined some wealthier Omegas might wear, but practical and warm all the same. Grace led her through the settlement, pointing out various buildings and introducing her to a handful of people they passed along the way. Most greeted her with polite curiosity, though Nora noticed a few wary glances, particularly from older pack members, who seemed to share Mara's concerns about her sudden arrival. "It will take time," Grace said, noticing Nora's discomfort at the mixed reception. "This pack has never had an Omega join under circumstances quite like yours. Give them a chance to understand, and they'll come around. Most of them anyway." They walked past a large training yard, where several pack members practiced combat drills, moving with a coordinated grace that spoke of years of discipline. Nora paused to watch, fascinated despite herself by the fluid precision of their movements. "Do you train too?" she asked Grace. "Every day," Grace said with a proud smile. "It's part of pack life. Everyone contributes in their own way, whether through combat, hunting, building, or countless other roles that keep the community running smoothly." Nora considered this, wondering what role she might eventually find for herself within this strange new world she had been thrust into so suddenly. Back home, before her uncle's betrayal, she had spent her days tending to household chores and caring for the small farm they maintained together. She wondered if any of those skills would translate into something useful here, or if she would remain forever an outsider, defined only by the circumstances of her arrival, rather than anything she might contribute herself. As if sensing her thoughts, Grace offered a reassuring smile. "You'll find your place here, Nora. Give it time. This pack may seem intimidating at first, but underneath all the tradition and hierarchy, we're simply people trying to build something safe and lasting together. You'll fit in more easily than you think." Nora hoped she was right, though the uncertainty of her new circumstances still weighed heavily on her mind as they continued their tour through the settlement, past the training yard, and toward a large communal garden, where several people worked among rows of vegetables and herbs, their laughter carrying easily across the open space, in a way that felt, for the first time since her ordeal began, almost normal. Days passed, and Nora slowly began to settle into a rhythm within the pack's settlement. She found herself drawn to the communal garden, offering her help to the small group who tended it each morning, and discovered a quiet satisfaction in the familiar work of pulling weeds and watering rows of vegetables that reminded her of simpler days before her uncle's betrayal had upended everything she once knew. The woman who oversaw the garden, a gentle soul named Claire, welcomed her without hesitation, teaching her which herbs held healing properties and which plants required extra care during the changing seasons. It was the first place within the settlement where Nora felt genuinely useful rather than simply tolerated, and she found herself looking forward to those quiet morning hours more than any other part of her day. Mara's suspicion, however, had not softened in the way Grace predicted it might. Nora noticed the older woman watching her from a distance on more than one occasion, her expression carefully neutral but never quite warm. She wondered if there was history behind that wariness beyond simple concern for tradition, though she did not feel comfortable enough yet to ask directly. One afternoon, while Nora sat alone near the edge of the garden, taking a brief rest from her work, Mara approached and settled onto the bench beside her without invitation. Nora tensed slightly, unsure what to expect from the encounter. "You've been keeping busy," Mara said, her tone giving away little. "It helps," Nora said carefully. "Having something useful to do, I mean. It keeps my mind from wandering too far into worry." Mara was quiet for a long moment, studying the rows of vegetables ahead of them, rather than looking at Nora directly. "I owe you an apology, perhaps," she said finally, surprising Nora considerably. "My reaction the night you arrived was not entirely fair to you. You did not choose the circumstances that brought you here, any more than Damon chose to complicate his position by claiming you." "I understand your concern," Nora said honestly. "I know my presence has created difficulties for him. It isn't just tradition that worries me," Mara admitted, her voice softening slightly. "Damon has carried a great deal of pain for many years, since before you or I would have crossed paths with him at all. I have watched him build walls around himself, refusing to let anyone close enough to reach the parts of him still wounded by what happened long ago. When Grace told me what he did at that auction house, stepping forward the way he did, I worried it meant those old wounds had been reopened rather than healed." Nora considered this carefully, remembering the quiet, vulnerable moment she had shared with Damon at dawn during their journey north, when he had told her about the person he had lost, the promise he had made to himself afterward. "He told me a little about what happened," she said gently. "About the person he lost. Is that who you're referring to?" Something shifted in Mara's expression, a flicker of surprise that Damon had shared something so personal with someone he had known for barely 2 days. "He rarely speaks of her," Mara said quietly. "Her name was Eliza. She was meant to be his mate, chosen for him in the traditional way, when he was still young enough that the choice felt more like an arrangement than a bond of love. But circumstances beyond his control saw her taken from him before that bond could ever fully form, sold away just as you nearly were. and by the time he had gathered enough strength and standing to search for her, she had already been lost to him entirely, her fate unknown to this day. Nora's chest tightened at the weight of this history, understanding now with far greater clarity the depth of the promise Damon had made to himself, and the courage it must have taken him to step forward at that auction house, despite whatever old grief the act surely stirred within him. "That's a terrible thing to carry," she said softly, "for so many years." "It is," Mara agreed, "and I worry, perhaps unfairly, that in trying to right an old wrong through you, he risks reopening a wound that never fully healed in the first place. I do not say this to frighten you, or to suggest you are unwelcome here. I say it because I care for him, and I want to understand his intentions before I allow myself to trust the situation fully." Nora appreciated the honesty, even if it left her with more questions than answers about her own place within this unfolding story. "I don't know what his intentions are, beyond wanting to see me safe," she said carefully. "He's been nothing but respectful since the moment he stepped forward. I don't believe he sees me as a replacement for someone he lost, if that's your concern." Mara studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Perhaps you're right," she said. "Time will tell, I suppose, as it does with most things worth understanding fully." She rose from the bench, brushing off her skirts before offering Nora a small, genuine smile, the first Nora had received from her since arriving. "Thank you for your honesty. I believe I have misjudged the situation somewhat, and for that, I am sorry." "Thank you for telling me about Eliza," Nora said. "It helps me understand him a little better." Mara nodded once more, before walking away, leaving Nora alone with her thoughts once again. She sat quietly for a long while, turning over everything she had just learned, feeling a new tenderness toward Damon that had not been there before, alongside a growing awareness of just how complicated the situation truly was, layered with old grief and old promises that had shaped the man he had become, long before she ever crossed his path. That evening, Damon found her in the garden as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink above the settlement. He approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, an unusual formality to his posture that suggested he had something specific on his mind. "Grace mentioned you spoke with Mara today," he said, settling onto the bench beside her, though he left a respectful distance between them. "She told me about Eliza," Nora said gently, watching his expression for any sign of discomfort at the mention of the name. Something flickered across his face, old pain surfacing briefly, before he mastered it once again. "I see," he said quietly. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before that history reached you, one way or another." "I'm sorry," Nora said, "for everything you went through. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been, losing her that way, and never knowing what became of her afterward." "It was a long time ago," Damon said, echoing the same words he had used during their conversation at dawn along the journey north. "I've made my peace with it, as much as anyone can make peace with something like that." Nora was not entirely convinced by his words, sensing the careful control beneath them, but she did not push the matter further, understanding instinctively that some wounds required patience rather than pressure to heal properly. "For what it's worth," she said instead, "I don't think what you did at that auction house was about replacing anyone. I think it was about refusing to let history repeat itself in the same cruel way twice, if it was within your power to stop it." Damon turned to look at her fully then, something in his gray eyes softening at her words in a way she had not seen before. "You understand more than most would, given how little time we've known each other," he said quietly. "Maybe some things don't require a long time to understand," Nora said, surprising herself with the boldness of the statement. "Sometimes you just recognize the truth of something when you see it clearly enough." They sat together in comfortable silence as the last light of day faded from the sky, the tension of old grief and unspoken questions settling into something quieter and more peaceful between them, at least for the moment. Nora did not know what the future held for either of them, given everything she had learned that day about the pain Damon carried and the fragile hope that had somehow taken root in the space where that pain had lived for so long. But she found herself, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely looking forward to discovering what came next. A full month passed before trouble found its way to Damon's settlement once more, though when it arrived, it came without warning, shattering the fragile peace Nora had begun to build for herself within the Pax community. She was in the garden with Claire, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, When the sound of distant shouting reached them across the settlement, both women straightened, exchanging uncertain glances before setting down their tools and hurrying toward the source of the commotion. A crowd had gathered near the entrance to the settlement, and Nora pushed through the edges of it just in time to see a group of unfamiliar riders being confronted by several of Damon's pack members, weapons drawn on both sides. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the rival Victor at the head of the opposing group, his cold smile unmistakable even from a distance. "Where is he?" the rival Victor called out, his voice carrying easily across the tense silence that had fallen over the crowd. "Where is your precious Alpha? I have business with him that cannot wait any longer." As if summoned by the demand itself, Damon appeared at the front of the gathered crowd, his expression hardening the moment his eyes landed on the rival group blocking the settlement's entrance. "You have no right to be here," he said, his voice carrying the same low, dangerous authority Nora had witnessed at the auction house weeks earlier. "This is a clear violation of the boundaries we agreed upon." "Boundaries change," the rival Victor said, echoing the same words he had used during their confrontation on the road weeks earlier. "Especially when there's unfinished business between us. You made a fool of me in front of my own men that day, refusing to yield the road, threatening consequences as though I were nothing more than a nuisance to be dismissed. I've come to settle that debt." "Then settle it with me directly," Damon said. "Leave my pack and this settlement out of whatever grievance you're carrying." The rival Victor's gaze shifted past Damon, searching the crowd until it landed on Nora, standing near the edge of the gathering. His smile widened in a way that made her blood run cold. "Perhaps there's another way to settle this debt," he said. "That girl you paid such an outrageous sum for. Hand her over, and I'll consider the matter closed between us." A ripple of tension passed through the crowd at the demand. Nora felt every eye shift toward her, and she fought the urge to shrink back, remembering once again the advice that had carried her through the auction weeks earlier. Whatever fear gripped her chest, she would not let it show, not here, not in front of the man who had already tried once to claim her, as though she were nothing more than a bargaining chip. "She is not a possession to be traded away to settle your grievances," Damon said, his voice dropping into something colder and more dangerous than Nora had ever heard from him before. "You will not come near her. This conversation is over." "Is it?" the rival Victor said, unfazed by the clear threat in Damon's tone. "I wonder if your pack shares your confidence, Damon. I wonder how many of them would truly stand behind you if it came to open conflict over one girl who isn't even pack-born. Perhaps it's worth finding out." The tension in the air grew thick enough that Nora could feel it pressing against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She glanced around at the gathered pack members, searching their expressions for any sign of hesitation, any indication that the rival's words had planted doubt where there should have been unity. To her relief, she found none. If anything, the crowd's expressions had hardened further, a collective resolve settling over them that left no room for the rival's attempted manipulation. "My pack stands behind whatever decisions I make regarding their safety and the safety of those under my protection," Damon said firmly. "You will find no division to exploit here. Leave now, or face the consequences of trespassing on my territory with clear hostile intent, exactly as I warned you weeks ago." For a long, tense moment, the rival Victor said nothing, his cold eyes studying Damon and the unified pack behind him with careful calculation. Finally, something shifted in his expression, a grudging recognition that the confrontation was not unfolding in the way he had hoped it might. "This isn't finished," he said, echoing his earlier threat. "But perhaps today isn't the day to settle it fully. Enjoy your borrowed time, Damon. Debts like this one have a way of coming due eventually, whether you're prepared for it or not." He pulled his horse back, gesturing for his men to follow, and the rival group retreated the way they had come, disappearing beyond the settlement's boundary once more. The tension in the crowd slowly began to ease, though whispered conversations broke out immediately, the confrontation clearly weighing heavily on everyone's mind. Damon turned toward Nora, crossing the distance between them quickly, his expression softening from the hard authority he had shown moments earlier into something closer to concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his gray eyes searching her face carefully. "I'm fine," Nora said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her best efforts to sound composed. "He wants to use me to hurt you. I don't understand why this has become so personal for him." "Old rivalries run deeper than most disputes," Damon said grimly. His grievance with me predates you by many years. You simply gave him a fresh excuse to act on grudges he's carried for a long time. What happened between you two? Nora asked, genuinely curious now about the history that had shaped such clear animosity. Damon's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, Nora thought he might deflect the question, the way he often did when conversations veered too close to painful subjects. But then he let out a slow breath, seeming to decide that after everything they had just faced together, she deserved an honest answer. Years ago, before I became alpha of this pack, his father held that position instead, Damon explained. He ruled through fear and cruelty, treating pack members as though they existed solely to serve his ambitions rather than as people deserving respect and protection. When circumstances allowed, I challenged him for leadership and won, ending a reign that had caused considerable suffering within his own pack. His son, the man you just saw, has never forgiven me for what he views as an insult to his family's legacy, regardless of how deserved that ending truly was. Nora absorbed this history carefully, understanding now the deeper layers of animosity that fueled the rival's aggression, tangled as it was with old family pride and a legacy built on cruelty that Damon had dismantled through force of will and conviction. He blames you for his father's downfall, she said slowly. And now he's looking for any excuse to strike back at you, using me as a convenient target. Essentially, yes, Damon confirmed. Though I want you to understand clearly, none of this is your fault. This conflict existed long before you arrived, and it would have found some outlet eventually, with or without your presence here. Despite his reassurance, Nora could not fully shake the guilt settling into her chest, the awareness that her arrival had given the rival Victor a fresh weapon to wield against a man who had shown her nothing but kindness and protection since the moment he stepped forward at that auction house. What happens now? She asked quietly. He said this isn't finished. Now, we prepare, Damon said, his expression hardening once more into the resolute determination she had witnessed at the auction house weeks earlier. Whatever comes next, I promise you this. I will not allow him to use you as a pawn in whatever twisted game he believes he's playing. You are under my protection, and that protection does not waver, regardless of the cost. Nora looked up at him, searching his gray eyes for any hint of doubt or hesitation, finding only steady resolve staring back at her. Whatever fear the confrontation had stirred within her, she found herself steadied by his certainty, by the unwavering conviction in his voice that left no room for question about where his loyalties truly stood. Thank you, she said softly, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of gratitude and trust that had grown between them over the past month, strengthened rather than diminished by the trials they had already weathered together. Come, Damon said, gently guiding her back toward the settlement's center, away from the lingering tension near the entrance. We have preparations to discuss, and I suspect this conversation is far from over, no matter how much either of us might wish otherwise. As they walked together through the settlement, Nora could not shake the feeling that the rival Victor's threat represented only the beginning of a much larger storm gathering on the horizon, one that would test not only Damon's resolve to protect her, but the very foundation of trust and loyalty that bound his pack together in the face of whatever challenges still lay ahead. In the days that followed the confrontation at the settlement's entrance, Damon's pack shifted into a state of quiet but purposeful preparation. Nora watched as extra patrols were organized, as Victor, the older pack member with the sharpening knife, took charge of reinforcing the settlement's outer defenses, and as Grace spent long hours in private conversation with Damon, planning contingencies for whatever the rival might attempt next. Nora felt increasingly restless during this period, uncertain of her place amid the mounting tension. She continued her work in the garden with Claire, finding some measure of peace in the familiar routine, but the underlying worry never fully left her thoughts. She could not shake the feeling that she remained, at the center of it all, the reason for the danger now gathering around the pack that had shown her nothing but kindness. One evening, unable to settle her restless mind, she sought out Damon in the small study attached to the main hall, where he had taken to spending long hours poring over maps and reports from his scouts. She knocked softly on the open door, and he looked up immediately, setting aside the papers he had been studying. Nora, he said, gesturing for her to enter. Is something wrong? I keep thinking about what happened, she said, stepping into the room and settling into the chair across from his desk. About everything you and your pack are risking because of me. I can't stop wondering if there's some way I could ease the burden, perhaps by leaving before things escalate further. Damon's expression shifted immediately into something firm and unyielding. Leaving would not ease anything, he said. It would only confirm to him that his intimidation tactics work, that he can threaten his way into getting whatever he wants. And more importantly, it would not guarantee your safety. If anything, it would leave you more vulnerable than you are here, under my protection. But your pack is preparing for a fight because of me, Nora pressed. That doesn't sit easily with me, Damon. These people have welcomed me into their home, and now they're facing danger because of a decision you made to save my life. Damon rose from his desk and came around to sit in the chair beside her, rather than remaining behind the barrier of his desk, an unusual gesture of informality that Nora had come to recognize as significant coming from him. Let me tell you something about this pack, he said quietly. We do not abandon our own to avoid difficulty. That has never been how we operate, not since I took on the responsibility of leading them. If we allowed fear of conflict to dictate every decision, we would have crumbled long before you ever crossed our path. I understand that, Nora said. But this feels different. This is a fight born from my circumstances specifically. It is a fight born from injustice, Damon corrected gently. The same injustice that took Eliza from me all those years ago. The same injustice that fills auction houses like the one where I found you, with people who deserve so much better than what the world has offered them. If we do not stand against men like him, men who believe cruelty and intimidation entitle them to whatever they desire, then what exactly are we protecting by remaining passive? Nora considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of conviction behind them settle something in her own chest as well. You truly believe that, she said softly. This isn't just about me anymore, is it? It's about everything you've built here, everything you stand for as a leader. It is about both, Damon admitted. I will not pretend my feelings toward your safety are purely a matter of principle at this point, Nora. But yes, it is also about what kind of pack I want to lead, what kind of example I want to set for those who look to me for guidance and protection. Something in his admission, the acknowledgement that his feelings toward her safety had grown into something more personal than simple principle, sent a warmth spreading through Nora's chest that she did not try to suppress this time. What kind of example is that? She asked quietly. One where we protect what matters, regardless of the cost, he said, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. And where we do not allow fear to dictate our choices, whether that fear comes from external threats or from our own hesitation to acknowledge what we've come to value. The silence that followed felt charged with unspoken meaning, and Nora found herself acutely aware of the small distance separating them, of the steady warmth radiating from him even in the cool evening air of the study. Damon, she began, uncertain exactly what she intended to say, only that the moment felt significant enough to require some kind of acknowledgement. Before she could find the right words, a sharp knock interrupted them, and Grace appeared in the doorway, her expression tense. Damon, you need to see this, she said, holding up a folded piece of parchment. A message arrived just now, left at the settlement's edge by one of the rival's scouts. Damon rose immediately, taking the parchment from Grace and unfolding it quickly. Nora watched his expression darken as he read, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger. What does it say? She asked, rising to stand beside him. Damon handed her the parchment wordlessly, and Nora read the message herself, her stomach twisting at the words scrawled across the page in hurried, aggressive script. The rival victor had set a deadline, 3 days, demanding that Damon surrender either Nora or a substantial portion of his territory as compensation for the perceived insult from weeks earlier, or face open conflict that would draw in allied packs on both sides. He's escalating faster than I expected, Damon said grimly, taking the parchment back and refolding it with controlled precision. This changes our timeline considerably. What are we going to do? Nora asked, fear creeping back into her chest despite her earlier resolve to remain steady. We prepare for the worst while hoping for a better outcome, Damon said. I will send word to allied packs, explaining the situation and requesting their support, should conflict become unavoidable. In the meantime, we strengthen our defenses and ensure everyone within the settlement understands the gravity of what we're facing. Grace nodded, already turning to relay instructions to the rest of the pack, leaving Damon and Nora alone once more in the tense quiet of the study. Nora looked up at him, searching his expression for any sign of doubt, finding instead the same unwavering resolve that had carried him through every challenge she had witnessed since the moment he stepped forward at that auction house. "Whatever happens," Nora said quietly, "I want you to know that I am grateful, more than words can properly express, for everything you've done, and everything you're continuing to risk on my behalf. Regardless of how this unfolds, that gratitude will not change." Damon reached out, his hand finding hers gently, a simple gesture that carried far more weight than the physical contact alone might suggest. "We will face whatever comes together," he said firmly. "That is my promise to you, Nora, and it is not one I intend to break, regardless of the cost this rivalry demands." Nora held his gaze, drawing strength from the steady conviction in his gray eyes, and found herself, despite the mounting danger gathering on the horizon, feeling less afraid than she had any right to feel given the circumstances. Whatever conflict awaited them in the coming days, she understood now, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would face it standing beside him, rather than hiding behind the walls of fear that had once defined so much of her existence. The 3 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation, tension building steadily within the settlement, as reports arrived from scouts monitoring the rivals' movements along the territory's borders. Nora found herself drawn increasingly into the pack's efforts, offering what help she could, whether tending to minor injuries sustained during defense drills, or simply providing quiet company to those whose nerves frayed under the weight of impending conflict. On the evening before the deadline was set to expire, the entire pack gathered in the main hall, Damon addressing them with the same commanding presence Nora had witnessed at the auction house weeks earlier, though now tempered with a warmth and unity that spoke to the genuine bond he shared with those he led. Nora stood near the back of the gathering, watching him rally his people with words of conviction and shared purpose, and felt, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, a profound sense of belonging to something larger than herself, something worth standing firm for, regardless of whatever danger the dawn might bring. Dawn broke gray and heavy over the settlement, mist clinging to the surrounding hills, as though the very land held its breath in anticipation of what the day might bring. Nora woke before sunrise, unable to sleep through the tension pressing down on her chest, and found Damon already awake, standing at the settlement's edge alongside Grace and Victor, studying the tree line beyond the border markers with grim focus. "Any sign of them?" she asked, approaching quietly. "Not yet," Damon said, not taking his eyes off the distant trees. "But the deadline expires within the hour. I expect we'll know soon enough what he intends to do." Nora positioned herself near Damon, drawing what comfort she could from his steady presence, despite the mounting dread twisting through her stomach. The settlement around them had transformed overnight. Pack members positioned strategically along the perimeter, weapons ready, expressions set with the same grim determination she had witnessed on Damon's face since the rival's message arrived days earlier. The minutes stretched painfully as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist to reveal a clear sky that felt almost mockingly peaceful given the tension gripping everyone below it. Then, just as the deadline's hour arrived, the sound of approaching riders reached them, and moments later, the rival Victor emerged from the tree line, at the head of a considerably larger force than he had brought during his previous visits. "Damon," the rival Victor called out, his voice carrying the same cold confidence Nora remembered from their earlier confrontations, though now backed by numbers that made the threat feel far more substantial. "I trust you've had time to reconsider my terms." "My answer remains the same as it was 3 days ago," Damon said, stepping forward to stand at the very edge of his territory, close enough to the boundary that Nora's heart pounded with fear for his safety. "Nora is not a bargaining chip, and I will not surrender an inch of territory to a man whose only claim to leadership rests on threats and intimidation." The rival Victor's expression hardened, any pretense of civility dropping away entirely. "Then you leave me no choice but to take what I came for by force," he said, raising his hand as a signal to the riders behind him. What happened next unfolded with a speed that left Nora's head spinning. Damon's pack surged forward in coordinated defense, the training Nora had witnessed in the yard over the past month, now displayed with brutal efficiency as they met the rivals' advancing riders at the settlement's border. Grace fought with fierce precision beside Victor, the two of them working in practice tandem to hold their section of the line, while Ethan darted between skirmishes, providing support wherever the defense seemed thinnest. Nora found herself pulled back toward the settlement center by Claire, who had appeared at her side the moment the conflict began, urging her toward the relative safety of the main hall. But Nora's eyes remained fixed on Damon, who fought at the very front of his pack's defense, his movements carrying a controlled fury that spoke to years of discipline, paired with the raw protective instinct she had come to recognize in him over the past weeks. The rival Victor, seeing his initial assault repelled more effectively than he had apparently anticipated, pressed forward himself, cutting through the chaos directly toward where Damon stood holding the line. Nora's breath caught as she watched the two leaders finally clash directly, their confrontation carrying the full weight of years of accumulated rivalry and grievance. "Nora, we need to get you inside," Claire urged, tugging at her arm, but Nora found herself frozen, unable to look away from the fight unfolding before her, fear for Damon's safety overriding every instinct toward self-preservation. The battle between Damon and the rival Victor raged with an intensity that silenced much of the surrounding conflict, as though even the other combatants understood instinctively that the true resolution of this dispute rested on the outcome of their direct confrontation. Damon fought with the same controlled precision Nora had witnessed in every other aspect of his leadership, while the rival Victor's attacks carried a wild desperation that spoke to years of resentment finally given full expression. For several tense minutes, the outcome remained uncertain, both men trading blows with a ferocity that left Nora's heart pounding in her throat. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, Damon found an opening in the rival's defense and pressed his advantage decisively, disarming him with a swift, calculated movement that left the rival Victor kneeling before him, defeated. "Yield," Damon said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden hush that had fallen over the battlefield as the surrounding fighters paused to witness the resolution of their leader's confrontation. "This ends now, one way or another." The rival Victor's face contorted with humiliation and barely restrained rage, but he understood, with the clarity that comes from staring down defeat, that he had no further options remaining to him. "I yield," he said finally, the words clearly bitter on his tongue. "Your forces will withdraw from my territory immediately," Damon said, still standing over him with unwavering authority. "And you will abandon any further claim against Nora, or this pack, permanently. If you violate these terms again, I will not offer the same mercy I'm extending to you now." The rival Victor nodded stiffly, rising slowly to his feet under Damon's watchful gaze. His remaining forces, seeing their leader's defeat, began retreating without further resistance, the tension that had gripped the settlement finally beginning to ease as the conflict drew to its close. Nora finally allowed herself to move, pushing past Claire's restraining hand and hurrying toward Damon as the last of the rival forces withdrew from the territory. He turned at her approach, and despite the exhaustion evident in his posture, his gray eyes softened immediately at the sight of her. "You're hurt," she said, noticing a shallow cut along his forearm that had gone unnoticed amid the chaos of battle. "It's nothing serious," he assured her, though he did not resist when she gently took his arm to examine the wound more closely. "Let me clean it properly at least," she said, her voice still shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Please, Damon, I need to do something with my hands right now, or I fear I might fall apart entirely." Something gentle passed across his expression at her admission, and he nodded, allowing her to lead him toward the main hall, where supplies for treating injuries had been gathered in preparation for the conflict. As she worked, cleaning and bandaging the wound with careful, steady hands despite the tremor still running through her, Damon watched her quietly, his expression carrying something Nora had not seen from him before, an openness that felt significant given everything she had come to understand about the walls he typically kept carefully in place. "You could have been seriously hurt," Nora said softly, focusing intently on the bandage rather than meeting his eyes, afraid of what her own expression might reveal in this vulnerable moment. "When I saw you facing him directly, I've never been more frightened in my entire life." "I've faced worse odds before," Damon said gently, "and I would face them again, without hesitation, if it meant ensuring your safety." Nora finally looked up at him, her hands stilling against the fresh bandage, now wrapped securely around his arm. "Why?" she asked, the question carrying far more weight than its single word might suggest. "Why does my safety matter so much to you, Damon? Truly?" Damon reached up, his hand gently cupping her cheek in a gesture so tender it stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Because somewhere along this journey, without either of us fully realizing when it happened, you stopped being simply someone I rescued, he said quietly, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You became someone I could not imagine losing. Someone whose safety matters to me as much as my own, perhaps more. Nora's heart pounded at his admission, the warmth spreading through her chest, now impossible to deny or dismiss as anything other than what it truly was. I feel the same way, she whispered. I think I have for a while now, if I'm being honest with myself. The moment stretched between them, charged with everything left unspoken across the weeks since he had stepped forward at that auction house and changed the entire trajectory of her life. Outside, the settlement stirred with the aftermath of battle, pack members tending to minor injuries, and beginning the process of restoring order after the chaos of conflict. But within the quiet space of the main hall, Nora and Damon remained still, finally allowing themselves to acknowledge the bond that had grown steadily between them since that fateful day when he had refused to let the world's cruelty claim her without a fight. In the weeks that followed the confrontation with the rival Victor, the settlement gradually returned to its familiar rhythms, the tension of conflict fading into memory as autumn deepened into the first chill of winter. Nora found herself settling more fully into the community she had once entered, as a frightened stranger, her days filled now with purpose and belonging, rather than the uncertainty that had marked her earliest weeks among Damon's pack. Mara, whose initial wariness had softened considerably following the honest conversation they shared in the garden, had become something of a mentor to Nora, teaching her the finer points of pack tradition and history that Nora found herself genuinely eager to learn. Grace remained a steadfast friend, their bond strengthened further by the shared experience of standing together through conflict. Even Claire's quiet companionship in the garden had grown into a friendship Nora treasured deeply, a reminder of the simple joys that remained possible, even after everything she had endured. And Damon, whose careful walls had finally begun to open following their conversation in the aftermath of battle, had become something far more significant in Nora's life than the feared Alpha who had once silenced an entire auction house with 3 simple words. Their relationship had deepened steadily in the weeks since, built on the foundation of trust and understanding they had forged through shared hardship, each finding in the other a partnership neither had believed themselves capable of experiencing again, after the losses and betrayals that had shaped their separate pasts. One crisp evening, as the settlement prepared for the season's harvest celebration, Damon found Nora in the garden, tending to the last of the season's herbs, before the first frost claimed them entirely. He approached quietly, watching her work for a long moment, before she noticed his presence, and looked up with a warm smile that had become as natural to her now as breathing. The celebration will begin soon, he said, settling onto the familiar bench where they had shared so many quiet conversations over the past months. Mara has been asking about you. I believe she intends to introduce you to several new arrivals joining the pack this season. I'll be there shortly, Nora said, brushing dirt from her hands as she joined him on the bench. I wanted to finish here first. Claire taught me these herbs hold particular value for treating winter illnesses, and I didn't want to risk losing the harvest to an early frost. Damon watched her with quiet affection, the same warmth she had grown accustomed to seeing in his gray eyes whenever his attention settled on her these days. You've built quite a life here, he observed. It's remarkable, watching how thoroughly you've made this place your home, given everything that brought you to it in the first place. I couldn't have done it without you, Nora said honestly. Without your protection, your patience, your willingness to see me as more than simply someone to be rescued and forgotten. You gave me the chance to build something real here, something I never imagined possible after my uncle's betrayal. You built it yourself, Damon corrected gently. I simply opened the door. Everything you've created since walking through it belongs entirely to you. Nora leaned into him slightly, resting her head against his shoulder as they sat together in the fading evening light. Do you remember what you said to me, that first night in the woods, when we spoke before dawn about why you stepped forward at the auction? She asked quietly. I remember, Damon said. I told you it wasn't just about you, that it could have been anyone on that platform. But then you said it wasn't anyone, Nora reminded him. It was me. It was, Damon confirmed, turning slightly to look at her directly, his expression carrying the same quiet intensity that had first drawn her attention weeks ago, though it had grown into something far deeper since. I've thought about that moment often, Nora, about what drew me to step forward that day, beyond the promise I made to myself after losing Eliza. I believe, even then, some part of me recognized something in you worth protecting, beyond simply righting an old wrong. Nora's heart swelled at his words, the honesty in them carrying a weight that felt both humbling and deeply affirming. I never properly told you, she said softly, how much that day changed everything for me. Not just because you saved me from whatever fate awaited on that auction platform, but because you showed me, for the first time since my parents passed, that I mattered to someone, that my life held value beyond whatever price a room full of strangers might place on it. You have always mattered, Damon said firmly, long before I ever stepped forward, and long after this moment passes into memory as well. I need you to understand that clearly, Nora. Whatever happens between us going forward, your worth was never something I gave you. It was something that existed within you all along, waiting for someone to recognize it properly. Tears gathered in Nora's eyes at the depth of sincerity in his words, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, simply allowing the warmth of his presence and the truth of his statement to settle fully into her heart. I love you, she said finally, the words emerging quiet but certain, carrying none of the uncertainty that had once defined so much of her existence. I don't know exactly when it happened, somewhere between the fear of that auction house and the quiet mornings we've shared since, but I know it's true now, completely. Damon's expression softened into something Nora had never seen from him before, a vulnerability entirely stripped of the composed authority he wore so naturally in every other aspect of his life. I love you too, he said, his voice carrying a rare tremor of emotion. More than I believed myself capable of feeling again, after everything the past taught me to fear about loss and grief. You have given me back something I thought I lost forever, Nora. Not just hope, but the willingness to open my heart fully to someone again. He reached into his coat, producing a small item Nora had not noticed him carrying, a simple silver pendant, carved with symbols she recognized now as traditional markers of pack bonding, the same kind Mara had shown her during their lessons on pack customs and traditions. I know our journey together began under circumstances neither of us would have chosen, Damon said, holding the pendant carefully between them. But everything that has grown between us since has been entirely our own choice, built on trust and respect rather than obligation or debt. I am not asking you to accept this because you feel you owe me anything, Nora. I am asking because I choose you, freely and completely, and I hope you might choose me in return. Nora looked at the pendant, then back at Damon's face, searching his gray eyes for any hesitation, and finding only steady, open sincerity staring back at her. I choose you, she said, her voice steady, despite the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. Not because you saved me, though I will always be grateful for that. I choose you because of everything you've shown me since, every quiet kindness, every moment of patience, every time you stood firm in protecting not just my safety, but my right to build a life of my own choosing here among your pack. Damon carefully fastened the pendant around her neck, his hands gentle despite the strength she knew they carried, and Nora felt something settle into place within her chest, a sense of belonging that had been building steadily since her arrival, but now felt fully complete. Around them, the sounds of the harvest celebration began drifting across the settlement, laughter and music carrying on the crisp evening air, a warm invitation to join the community that had become her true home. They rose together, hand in hand, walking toward the gathered lights and warmth of the celebration ahead. Nora glanced back once at the quiet garden behind them, at the bench where so many important conversations had unfolded between fear and hope, grief and healing, and felt a profound gratitude settle over her for the winding, difficult path that had led her here. She had been abandoned once, sold like property to strangers, who saw only her price rather than her worth. But standing now beside Damon, wearing the pendant that marked the beginning of a future neither of them had dared imagine possible during those darkest early days, Nora understood with complete certainty that she had not simply been claimed by a feared alpha that day at the auction house. She had been chosen, and in choosing him in return, freely and completely, she had finally found the home she never knew she had been searching for all along.